Our two speakers for this session are David Cloutier and Jame Schaefer. David Cloutier, up until now, has held the not professorship in Catholic theology and Catholic social thought at Mount St. Mary's University, but David is going to move from there this fall, I understand, to assume a post as Associate Professor of Theology at Catholic University in Washington. Professor Cloutier received his MA and PhD in theology from Duke. His most recent book publications are The Vice of Luxury, Economic Excess in a Consumer Age, and Walking God's Earth, the Environment and Catholic Faith. Next to David would be Jame Schaefer, who is also an Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Ethics at Marquette University, where she received her PhD in Systematic Ethics. She focuses her teaching and research on the constructive relationship of theology, the natural sciences, and technology, with particular attention to religious foundations for ecological ethics. Jame's publications include Confronting the Climate Crisis, Catholic Theological Perspectives, which was issued by Marquette Press in 2011, and Environmental Justice and Climate Change, Assessing Pope Benedict XVI's Ecological Vision for the Catholic Church in the United States. Both of our speakers have 25 minutes each to talk, and then there will be, as in the last session, opportunities for discussions, for questions, and for anything else about the topics they have talked about. So join me, please, to welcome David to the podium.
Thank you, Father Paulinus, and thank you to the Lumen Christi Institute for sponsoring this very, very stimulating conversation. We're going to be shifting, of course, into talking more about social thought, but I do have a bunch of things to say to the economists here, though you may not be happy with some of the things I'm saying. So please push back. Please push back at me. I'm trying to learn to be more than an amateur economist, which is very dangerous for a Catholic social ethicist, but useful as opposed to knowing no economics at all. All right, so it's very difficult in this day and age to avoid issue fatigue, and with it the tendency to tune out or at least tone down the demands on us from every quarter about this issue or that issue. And there's no doubt that the environment has become one of those issues. It's central to the worldview and lifestyle of some, but for most people it is an issue that does not dominate their consciousness. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis sets out to change that. For him, the environmental crisis is exhibit A of the fact that, as he says repeatedly, everything is connected to everything else. He firmly embeds love of the earth as part of the intertwined relationships of love of God and neighbor that make up the fabric of creation. And of course, he repeatedly notes the connection between environmentalism and the poor, explaining that these are not two different crises, but one. Most of all, his encyclical insists on the urgency of the issue, noting that, quote, "It is remarkable how weak international political responses have been," and calling out deniers, saying that such, quote, evasiveness is, quote, "how human beings contrive to feed their self-destructive vices, trying not to see them, trying not to acknowledge them, delaying the important decisions and pretending that nothing will happen." So if all of this is true, it's clear that the environment is not simply one issue among many. For this audience today, I want particularly to highlight how Francis sees the issue of the environment as the place where deep spiritual renewal that Catholic teachers of the Catholic faith should be interested in, and transformative economic change economists should be interested in. It's the place where these two things meet. I want to highlight one particular problem that the Pope notes in the encyclical and one particular solution that he proposes, and then explain how his observation should impact the work of both church teachers and economists. But before I get to those particular issues, I've been charged with situating the encyclical within the tradition of Catholic social thought, which is pretty easy because he doesn't propose any new teaching, really, at the level of key principles. Rather, he extends existing Catholic social principles. And I'll just highlight what I think are the two most important. First, Francis highlights the importance of respecting the order and beauty of creation as having an integrity in its own right. It is not merely instrumental for humanity. That's a kind of core principle in the encyclical. For Pope Benedict, the idea that creation has a grammar or an inbuilt order that we must respect was the centerpiece of his environmental teaching in Caritas in Veritate. This order is beautiful chiefly because creation is a gift from God and thus illuminates the fundamental experience of gift that Benedict says we should place at the heart of the human economy. Francis writes, creation can only be understood as a gift from the outstretched hand of the Father of all and as a reality illuminated by the love which calls us together into universal communion. So this is the fundamental basis on which we should view creation as a gift. Our dominion over creation does not mean that we can trash the gift, but rather we must till and keep or serve and preserve the creation. The Pope lays special emphasis on the idea that each creature has its own purposes and none is superfluous. All creatures have a vocation towards God. How? By being what they are called to be. Now, of course, this beautiful order that is prior to us is also at the heart of Catholic teachings on the sanctity of life and of marriage and the family. Do not instrumentalize your spouse. Do not instrumentalize sex. Do not instrumentalize a dying person. But this order cannot stop at the skin of the human body. How about do not instrumentalize cows? This is what Francis wants. What is living in accord with the cow's nature look like? Most of us can imagine the contented cow. Even though the cow is thoroughly domesticated and serves many human uses, we still appreciate the beauty of pastoral landscape centered on the cow. The Midwestern town where I went to college, its slogan is cows, colleges, and contentment. But did the milk, cheese, or beef you most recently enjoyed come from a contented cow? Unless you paid a premium, it probably did not. Instead, it came from a poor creature in a confined animal feed operation where cows are packed together in mud and other things, filled with antibiotics and force-fed an unnatural diet of corn. And that's not even to talk about the slaughterhouse experience that they face after the feedlot. This is the system that, of course, gives us the miracle of cheap beef, but it also exemplifies the distortion of the beautiful natural relationships intended by God. Not a brief for vegetarianism, just a brief for treating cows like cows, whatever that means. Okay. A second theme in the encyclical, continuous with prior Catholic social teaching, is the emphasis on the universal destination of goods as the fundamental Catholic teaching on the proper end of property. Francis writes, God rejects every claim to absolute ownership. The universal destination of goods is based on this first point, right, that creation is prior to us. But it further indicates that our stewardship is directed not simply for our private benefit, but for the common good, for the good of all. The importance of the universal destination of goods in the Church's overall moral catechesis is often lost. If 3 of the central commandments are about life, thou shalt not kill, sex, and property, then the theological foundations of these commandments need to function like the kind of foundational supports that we use to stabilize bridges and large buildings. They need to be very deeply sunken into Catholics. Threats to the God-given dignity of the human person at every stage of development, or to monogamous lifelong commitment to marriage and family, are quite prominent in our culture. Yet the church's vigorous fight on these issues is only possible because these foundations are still there and still exercise some power in ordinary people's consciousness. That is, monogamy, lifelong monogamy, is still attractive to most people in our culture, right? Even if they don't achieve it. Yet the foundation pillar of the commandments about use of property, the universal destination of goods, is likely first to elicit blank stares from people. What is it? Right? And then when it is adequately understood, strong opposition. You mean I have to give my excess wealth away to other people? Yes. We simply are not used to thinking of our wealth as having a social mortgage attached to it. We don't find any candidates of any political party even giving lip service to this concept, yet Francis calls it the golden rule of social conduct. Now, why is this idea central to addressing environmental challenges? I'll just mention two examples. The first is pretty simple. It will cost us money and resources to do things in environmentally better ways, and that means we won't be able to put those resources into other things that we might want. There is no free lunch. There are always trade-offs. And so rules about the efficiency of vehicles, for example, will constrain our choices or at least affect them and require at least some people to pay more for a car. But in fact, many people already pay a lot more for cars anyway, just for different preferences. We need to understand constraints on our purchasing due to resources put into environmental improvements as an instance of directing our goods to their universal destination rather than to our private satisfaction. Secondly, most serious environmental economists suggest that some kind of shared limiting of control over land and resource ownership is necessary to curb exploitation. I'm not talking about the social ownership of resources, but for example, regulations over coal workers. We were just talking about this before the break in terms of avoiding unsustainable degradation of land. Because of the universal destination of goods understood in the light of sustainability challenges, the church should have a dog in the fight of zoning laws, for example. It seems evident that zoning laws, the bane of many economists, however, are at least driven to saying that it is not neutral. The kind of housing that people prefer is not a neutral, morally neutral choice. In fact, they should prefer dense housing that is less fossil fuel dependent than our housing stock presently. Okay, so much for the continuity on those first two big principles. What are the essential challenges and solutions that Francis draws out of this? As I said, one big challenge, one big solution. Perhaps the most novel element of the encyclical is its third chapter, Francis's critique of the technocratic paradigm as, quote, the human origin of the ecological crisis. He describes the technocratic paradigm as a new attitude towards nature itself. So it's not anti-technology. This is an extended quote from Francis. Men and women have constantly intervened in nature, technology good, but for a long time, this meant being in tune with and respecting the possibilities offered by the things themselves. Think the contented cow. You can get things from the contented cow without making the cow discontent. It was a matter of receiving what nature itself allowed as if from its own hand. Now, by contrast, the Pope says, we are the ones to lay our hands on things, attempting to extract everything possible from them while frequently ignoring or forgetting the reality in front of us. Human beings and material objects no longer extend a friendly hand to one another. The relationship has become confrontational. So that is the technocratic paradigm. It might sound like a critique of technology, but the Pope's argument is more subtle than that. He's concerned with cases where technological power becomes an end in itself, and we are not guided in developing technological power by either genuine human ends, right, or by the nature of things themselves. The Pope's claim that technology is not neutral is very important. Some people make the argument that technology is all about what you use it for. You can use a smartphone for pornography or for liturgy of the hours. Now that's true, right? But it overlooks the fact that the technology itself, especially at the broader cultural level, has certain biases. For example, children having smartphones of their own simply puts power in the hands of those who are not ready to use it. Research on digital natives is fast confirming what I think many of us know. The constant stream of social media is leading young people towards more superficial and deceptive relationships because that's the built-in bias of the technology. Where does this lead? According to Francis, the ultimate result is the limits for human living are now set by the possibilities shaped by the technology rather than by human nature. So I'll say that again. The limits for human living are now set by the possibilities shaped by the technology rather than by human nature. And most of that technology and its continual development is in the hands of large corporations whose primary motivation is to profit from pushing the technologies forward. To quote Francis directly, we have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. Decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build. So Francis issues a very deep challenge here, but as he himself notes, again, this is a quote, nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age. I'm glad he said that. Rather, what we need is to slow down and look at reality in a different way, to recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. So what he's asking for is the recovery of a certain kind of spirituality, one that converts us from sin to joy at a deeper level. This spirituality is the solution that I'll highlight. In the last chapter, after a lengthy engagement with international politics, Francis turns to us and says, quote, many things have to change course, but it is we human beings, above all, who need to change. Francis's papacy, contrary to the claims of some, hasn't been different because he's changing teaching. It seems to me the Francis effect is that incredible presence, that ability to look at us with a powerful spiritual gaze and prompt an examination of conscience within us, a call to recognize sin in our lives and seek change. In this chapter, he walks through 3 phases of our sinfulness in relationship to the environment. First, the Pope speaks about the importance of education. To some extent, we must simply become more aware of the delicate complexities of the ecosystems on which our lives depend. We need not become experts on species extinction or atmospheric dynamics, but we do need to have a basic literacy that our actions, individually and collectively, have consequences. When we turn on the car ignition, we produce waste, and we need to take responsibility for that waste. If Francis criticizes us as a throwaway culture, it is because we have too little sense of the away. But Francis insists we need more than education. We also need conversion. This is especially true on environmental issues. The fact is we often know what is the better environmental choice, and yet we don't do it. We opt for convenience or comfort. We convince ourselves that our little actions don't matter. But the Pope writes that these little actions do matter. Why? Because they reduce global carbon emissions by 2 ounces or something like that, an insignificant amount? No, because they shape the moral tenor of society by calling forth a goodness that inevitably tends to spread, he says. So when we make the small choices, we shape the moral tenor of society. This attention to details shows the depth of our real care. When we make choices for the sake of our family members, or our friends, we often go to great lengths to get the details right. Think of the efforts that may be put into an anniversary celebration, or a gift, or a family vacation. We show our priorities by our attention to details. And do we prioritize our common home? When we do not, even though we know, we commit what Aquinas calls sins of malice, the worst sorts of sins in a subjective sense, because we choose what we know to be the lesser good as the greater good. We choose a few minutes of our time over future generations, for example. Yet Francis doesn't stop here with conversion, because once we are converted, we must live a new lifestyle, and the Pope characterizes this lifestyle with reference to two virtues: humility and sobriety. These, he wryly says, were not favorably regarded in the last century. But they need to make a comeback, right? This is my vice of luxury speech. His descriptions at this point are particularly powerful. Sobriety, he says, and sobriety has nothing to do with alcohol, or little to do with alcohol. It's not a lesser life or one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a different way of living life to the full. In contrast to those who live dipping here and there, always on the lookout for what they do not have, sobriety enables us to appreciate each person and each thing, learning familiarity with the simplest things and how to enjoy them. He sums this up in a pithy phrase: the sober, even living on little, live a lot. These virtues are fundamentally about restraint, and they are violated by what Aquinas calls sins of passion. We want sparkly surfaces, but in fact, we should live lives where we send out deep roots. So Francis's forthright critique of the technocratic paradigm and a recommendation of a life of ecological conversion and sobriety pose particular challenges, and here I'm going to talk about the two challenges. One for teachers of the Catholic faith, and the other for economists interested in the Catholic faith. I now turn to what these challenges look like. For teachers of the Catholic faith, Francis is making unavoidable something that has in fact been present in Catholic social thought consistently. Catholics in the United States must live materially differently than they do now, perhaps radically so. There needs to be candor that whatever a society practicing integral ecology looks like, it is not this society that we presently live in the United States. Francis writes with welcome directness, "We all know that it is not possible to sustain the present level of consumption in developed countries and wealthier sectors of society," end quote. But do we all know this? I know this is not a welcome message to bear to the people in parishes. But without this candor, I fear the encyclical's message is reduced to sentimentalities about caring for cows or being green. We are in desperate need of building imaginations capable of envisioning and practicing alternative configurations of lifestyle choices. What Brad Gregory calls the goods life, the consumer economy ultimately built on what Father John Ryan called the higher standard of living fallacy, is simply not compatible with integral ecology, and Catholics should be called to give it up. The biggest reason to state this problem bluntly is because once you get down into the weeds of particular problems, should I own a car, there is endless and understandable debate. That is to say, there's not going to be one-size-fits-all solution at the level of detail, but there is a one-size-fits-all overall message that people should get so that they can look at the details in their own lives and make prudential decisions in accord with right principles. The path taken will be different for people in different circumstances, but what must be shared is a sense that business as usual isn't an option. By any ecological measure, the average lifestyle of a citizen of the United States far exceeds any standard for what might be sustainable, but this lifestyle is a relatively recent invention. It's not like everyone took for granted the goods life in 1900. And even in 1950, the impact of the emerging consumer lifestyle was still mitigated. Anyone who looks at the standard size of new homes built in the Levitt towns of America in 1950 will recognize that they are less than half the average square footage of new housing today. Why? 1950 was fine, right? Well, we can quarrel with these judgments, right? But at least Catholics should recognize that that was a reasonable standard of living as opposed to what we've come to expect. It should be named, in fact, as Francis names it, delusions of grandeur. I've suggested elsewhere the recovery of the language of luxury as a vice, because we seem to lack a language that expresses economic modesty and restraint at some level that is not Dorothy Day, we move into a Catholic worker, but also not spiritualized to death. The important thing is not to be attached to your money, even though you have lots of it. It's not as if the Sunday readings are lacking in opportunities to preach on these matters, especially as we read through Luke this year. But too often the message of the gospel is blunted by statements like, quote, "There is nothing wrong with being rich." I think we need to change that statement. The more accurate statement would be something like, "There is nothing wrong with making money. But there is something wrong with having too many possessions." I just don't think you can read the Gospels and recognize that having too many possessions is not a problem. And the real point about money is what you do with it. Moreover, this is a message that is not simply about the 1%. It is likely that the message will have to resonate with what I like to call the 39%, the top two income quintiles in American society. For us, we need to face that we are the 1% in terms of the world, in terms of lifestyle. We often live much less soberly than we might, and in doing so, we sacrifice not only the planet, but our poor neighbors. Now, having said all of this about the gospel in my hometown, I come from the northwest side of Chicago, I am ready for someone to march me to the edge of the lake and throw me into it. So let me turn to the economists to suggest that this is not as impractical and radical as it might seem. I think the key task is to do a better job of figuring out how to tune our economic tools to ethical visions. The relationship between economics and ethics is an extremely interesting one, but disciplinary specializations on both sides have muddied this connection. Ethicists often have frankly incorrect ideas about economics. We should just face up to that, and are too quick to blame economists for sins that many do not actually commit. And economists lack a clear sense of what it would mean to integrate ethics into economics rather than have it as a kind of rider that rides on separately. Now, in this short space, I can't explore these ideas completely. So what I'll do is recall Francis's vision of resisting technocracy and living in sobriety and ask, how would the economy function in a society that looked like this? We needn't be immediately terrified that we would descend into underconsumption and depression. Instead, let's confront certain difficult questions for which neither economists nor their critics have easy answers. Francis isn't critiquing markets per se. The emphasis on personal spirituality makes it very clear that command and control solutions aren't going to work either. His work on this score is no different from that of John Paul II or Benedict. Market economies are fine, but they are not simply neutral instruments. It is a longer step than sometimes imagined from the fundamental insights of Adam Smith about incentives and the division of labor and the extension of trade, all, it seems to me, good things, to the global economy dominated by large corporations and protected from critique by the overly rigid mathematization of some parts of the economic discipline. What we are dealing with here is a matter of two aspects of what Dan Finn calls the moral ecology of markets, where we cannot really separate economic insight about human behavior from moral claims. One is the way that we construct markets themselves. Francis uses the example of three pressing problems in his first chapter: the loss of biodiversity, the problem of water, and the carbonization of the atmosphere. In each one of these, arguments can be made for constructing or reconstructing markets. And indeed, the overall outcome on these matters is powerfully affected by the fundamental shape of the market because they are so intertwined with the global supply system. One longtime advocate of reshaping the market in ways that address environmental concerns is William Nordhaus. He assumes that global warming begins and ends with human activities, and thus real progress is only possible if current economic incentives are shifted so that people do pay the full cost of their emissions. At present, those who burn fossil fuels are enjoying an economic subsidy. In effect, they are grazing on the global commons and not paying for what they eat. He acknowledges that we can surely trim some fat from our consumption, but most people resist major lifestyle changes, which would be required to achieve anything close to the necessary cuts to achieve the kinds of global emission cuts that we need to head off global warming. Thanks. Thus, the real challenge is setting a carbon price, and Nordhaus suggests that the cost must be substantial enough to shift consumption. Now, I focus on Nordhaus because he reviewed Laudato Si in the New York Review of Books, a mark of how much a part of the cultural zeitgeist Francis is. Nordhaus lauds the text as an eloquent description of the natural world and its relationship to human societies, and appreciates its, quote, poetic and epic qualities. I think this is a way of economists damning with faint praise. But he is concerned that the encyclical overlooks the central role that markets must play in improving things. And in the review, he takes particular issue with the Pope's seeming criticism of carbon credits. Pope Francis notes that the carbon credit system seems to provide a quick and easy solution under the guise of a certain commitment to the environment, but in no way does it allow for the radical changes which present circumstances require. Nordhaus responds by pointing to numerous cap-and-trade successes and hoping that people overlook this passage, since carbon pricing is, quote, the only practical policy tool we have. Nordhaus also worries that the Pope's sweeping condemnations of capitalism are drawn too starkly, and these would be better understood as market failures. Moreover, in his book, Nordhaus notes that the no-growth scenario envisioned by some means that, quote, billions of people will be stuck in poverty and disease for the indefinite future. But he also adds that it would mean, quote, the era of technological miracles would end with the iPhone 5. I just don't think those are equivalent statements, and I think the fact that economists see them as equivalent statements that can follow upon one another, we won't have an iPhone 5 and millions of people will starve, right? Indicates that something has gone wrong. And indeed, in the New York Review of Books review, I point out that Nordhaus at one point says that one major and paradoxical insight about ethical behavior in a market economy is that the efficient performance of a market economy does not depend upon the ethics of individual behavior. And the word ethics here is clearly used in a particular way because he actually goes on to point out the conventional restrictions on force and fraud that economists will point out. But what he means is that they don't depend on some kind of altruistic or self-restraining ethics. That's the ethics that they don't depend on. And so there's a kind of built-in bias against altruism, or at least against restraint in behavior. It seems to me that ethics requires us to recognize that humans can and do act with restraint, act with attention to collectives more often than economists will sometimes indicate. What economists need, it seems to me, is a better account of how their tools tune in particular ways based on ethical claims, and perhaps most especially on an overall account of what economic prosperity looks like. That is what the telos of an economy is. Is it preventing starvation, or is it the iPhone 6? Those are not the same telos. Catholic social teaching echoes ecological economics in saying that grow forever is not the ultimate good, and John Paul II, almost 30 years ago, critiqued superdevelopment. While there are still so many underdeveloped nations in the world, perhaps we need a different set of tools, or to use my metaphor, differently tuned tools, to understand economic success in already developed countries. This is actually about a different element of Dan Finn's moral ecology, what he calls the morality of individuals and groups. We might also call it culture. The fact is that responding to Laudato Si means we have to think collectively about what sort of people together, what sort of culture we want to be. It's quite simply mistaken to rule this out, either on the grounds that economics is simply agnostic about ends, or on the grounds that human nature can't be changed. We did not become the culture we are now simply by some sort of non-intentional evolution of nature. The fundamental insight of market economics is that incentive systems matter for coordinating widespread cooperation among strangers towards certain goals. This should be applauded, but those goals do not need to be McMansions and SUVs. So, in conclusion, I'll just reiterate the basic points that Francis makes. Against the backdrop of ordered creation and the universal destination of goods, Francis criticizes the technocratic paradigm that captures our society today and calls for a spiritual renewal based on a lifestyle of conversion and sobriety. For church leaders, I think this means recovering language to critique our lifestyle assumptions, and for economists, I think this means improving the tuning or harmonizing of economic tools with some of these ethical claims. Now, it's not a system that Francis lays out. If one thing is certain about Francis, it's that he's not a systematic thinker. But it is a strong, no, that's good. We need lots of different kinds of thinkers. But it is a strong, powerful, captivating vision that binds together love of God, neighbor, and the earth to point out that the environment isn't just one issue among many. Rather, it's the nexus where everything connects. Thank you.
So, this first encyclical dedicated to the ecological crisis has definitely advanced Catholic thought into a more inclusive category, a much more inclusive category. Rerum Novarum, we know, ushered societal problems into our consciousness and stimulated addressing them from a Catholic theological perspective. Bishops and scholars have addressed these problems: socialism, capitalism, warfare, particularly nuclear warfare, racism, suffering persons, the growing disparity between the wealthy and the poor individuals and nations, overconsumption, abortion, the death penalty, and other injustices, especially those that affect the poor and vulnerable in our society. The primary emphasis of these statements and research by scholars has been on human-to-human interaction. The sciences that were engaged are represented well here: economics, but also political science and sociology. And the reflections and work by bishops, by teachers, by scholars were informed by these sciences, and increasingly informed by these sciences, in order to come up with plausible ways of dealing with these many problems that we face. And we've come up with then some major principles of Catholic social teaching that you're all familiar with, but just let me point out the major ones. Respecting the life and dignity of human persons, of each human person, acknowledging our rights and responsibilities, participating in family and community life, our solidarity as persons seeking the common good of all persons, our obligation to show preference for the poor and the vulnerable, and then following the principle of subsidiarity, and that is, we need to act on the local level to the extent of our self-governance, and then leave to the next level action that we cannot actually achieve on our own. As we know, these principles of Catholic social teaching were upheld by bishops who particularized them in their own areas, in their own geographic areas. And scholars have researched and reflected upon these principles in many different ways. And David is a wonderful example of reflection on Catholic social teaching. And we've done that all from the perspective of the life, dignity, and well-being of human persons. Gradually, however, concern for the adverse effects of pollutants in the air, on the land, and in the water crept into research agendas of some scholars. And also, when bishops were speaking from their own areas on problems that were occurring there. In 1971, Pope Paul VI included among the new emerging social problems the degradation of the environment. And then we know in 1990, St. John Paul II issued the very first papal statement dedicated to the ecological crisis. And that was on the World Day of Peace in 1990. And he expressed growing concern about ecological degradation, especially on the poor and vulnerable, in subsequent encyclicals. Pope Benedict XVI followed up, as has been mentioned already last night and today, expressing his concern about the effects of ecological degradation, especially on the poor and vulnerable, and how they were threatening the future generations and the kind of world that they were going to be inheriting. And his statement then on the World Day of Peace in 2010 underscored what St. John Paul II had expressed 20 years earlier. And we've already heard about Benedict XVI and how he demonstrated himself as a green pope. Many pastoral statements in between those times had been issued by bishops around the world, and they're absolutely wonderful statements underscoring the adverse effects of ecological degradation in their geographic areas. And I encourage you, if you haven't read some of these beautiful statements, they're all available online from our webpage at Marquette University in the Interdisciplinary Minor for Environmental Ethics program. One of my honors program students updated the documents that have been issued by bishops last summer, and we're very happy to make those available to everybody else. And it's in these statements, beginning especially with St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and the bishops around the world, that we have engagement with the natural sciences, another science. And this becomes very important to add to then the wonderful work that had been done engaging economics and engaging political science and engaging sociology. However, little attention had been given by the media, and my students tell me from the pulpit, and I can say that from my own experience, to these various statements by popes and by bishops. That is, not until the phenomenon of Jorge Mario Bergoglio came to be Pope of our church. He certainly has captured the attention of people throughout the world, captured the attention of the media, some say the adoration, if not the admiration of the media. And of course, we're hearing more and more about ecological issues, and especially things that Pope Francis has been doing in various avenues in which he has engaged, and there are many. I have to tell you that in the 40 years that I have worked on ecological issues from various capacities, I have never experienced the interest in the ecological environment and what is happening to our home, planet Earth, as I have in the time just before Laudato Si was issued and then afterwards. As I told one of the delegates at a meeting, delegates from Cardinal Turkson's Pontifical Academy last year when we were at a conference in France, Pope Francis is really keeping us theologians busy, and indeed he has. So these wonderful statements now that are coming out of different geographic areas by bishops, building upon Laudato Si, have been indeed very inspiring. And the fact that we're engaging the natural sciences in our dialogue, now our Catholic social dialogue, I think has certainly helped us a great deal in becoming very public in addressing ecological issues from a moral perspective. And I have come to the conclusion that the interest that Laudato Si has generated and the use of the natural sciences that Pope Francis has incorporated in his statements and demonstrated in his actions, has now brought us into, I think, a new era of Catholic social thought. We simply cannot talk about Catholic thought anymore as social per se. We need to have an expansive view, a more inclusive view of Catholic thought. And I recommend a new category, a more inclusive category of Catholic thought that I'm referring to as Catholic planetary thought. That is, teaching from a Catholic theological perspective about the entire community of Earth. Humans, yes, but also other species, the air, the land, the water, ecological systems, the biosphere, our common home. Catholic planetary thought that includes the constituents of all members of the Earth community. This requires bringing into dialogue all dimensions of knowing to address the urgent problems, and Pope Francis covered several of them in Laudato Si, the problems of air pollution, human-forced climate change, the accumulation of wastes of all times due to overconsumption and just plain wastefulness, the decline in quality and availability of potable water, and the loss of biological diversity. All of these urgent problems most adversely affect poor and vulnerable people, poorer nations that are struggling to develop in a way, hopefully, that will not replicate some of the ways in which we've developed in the so-called materially developed world. So, Catholic planetary teaching, then, gives us some new, enriched, and inclusive ideas about the Catholic social principles that are well known to all of us. Take, for an example, respecting and upholding the life and dignity of human persons. From a Catholic planetary thought perspective, we would be recognizing the uniqueness of each person and our capacity to know our connectedness with other persons, other species, with whom we share a common home. From a Catholic planetary perspective, the dignity of human persons encompasses the ability to recognize how dependent we are upon other species and abiota, the air, the land, and the waters, for the necessities of life. From a Catholic planetary perspective, the dignity of human persons encompasses realizing how late we arrived as a species from the hominid lineage through the biological evolutionary process. And our need, then, to use these wonderful qualities of cognition and our affective abilities and volitional capabilities to function in relation to other species in ways that facilitate our mutual flourishing. Our mutual flourishing. Catholic planetary teaching would look at the Catholic social teaching principle of participating in family and community life from the perspective of participating as members of the Earth community, participating with other species and systems that encompass our planet Earth, participating in constructive ways that facilitate our mutual flourishing, the flourishing of the entirety of the Earth community. From a Catholic planetary thought perspective, we would be honoring the rights of all people to flourish, as well as other species and systems, ecological systems, and the biosphere. We would be recognizing their right to flourish, and the flourishing then that would be facilitated for future generations who will inherit the earth that we are now on a path of destroying. From a Catholic planetary perspective, we definitely would be demonstrating preferences for the poor and vulnerable. We would be continuing to attend to the plight of the suffering of the poor and vulnerable people, individuals, and nations. We would include, of course, future peoples who will be inheriting our planet. We would also, from a Catholic planetary thought perspective, be showing preference for poor species, poor systems, ecological systems, many of which we've been destroying through our actions, our thoughtless actions. And they then become, with Sally McFagg and other theologians, the new poor for which we would be giving preference. And Pope Francis urges this. And I was absolutely amazed when reading Laudato Si that he talks about the intrinsic value of other species, that we value them in themselves, for themselves, in the order of creation that David was just talking about. We recognize that we use them, but yet at the same time we're balancing their intrinsic value in this whole wonderful web of life. And another perspective that must be given to this notion of intrinsic value is that all creatures, human and non-human, and systems as well for Pope Francis, have this intrinsic value in part because they manifest God's presence to us. And of course, that idea of the sacramentality of creation goes way back to the Old Testament, especially to the Book of Wisdom, picked up by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans and other letters as well, and then built upon and persisting as the most prominent concept that we find in the Catholic theological tradition in creation theology, the sacramentality of creation. That is, all creatures manifest God to us. It is through the visible creation that we know about and we can experience the presence of God, a most prominent notion in the Catholic theological tradition. And Catholic planetary thought will build upon that, to value other species and ecological systems and the whole biosphere in themselves and for themselves, and seeing ourselves as participants in that community of Earth. And we would then value them and protect them and make decisions then that are conscious of them as poor and vulnerable. Catholic planetary thought also relates to, quite profoundly, the notion of the solidarity of all people. But Catholic planetary thought would move beyond that to talk about the solidarity of all species and systems, of Earth solidarity, thinking of ourselves and valuing all constituents of Earth and seeing ourselves as functioning as constituents of Earth solidarity. We are of Earth. Our emergence as a species from earlier hominids is well documented by data, by reports, and by discussions in the scientific literature. Our solidarity with Earth is incorporated in newly burgeoning discourse on the relationship between theology and the natural sciences, which is my focus academically. And of course, it's been popularized by some of the media. From an initial beginning of the universe, its expansion, and the subsequent death of stars that yielded elements essential to life, to the formation of billions of galaxies, of which at least one had a solar system with a planet within which simple forms of life emerged, and an evolutionary process within Earth that yielded increasingly complex species. Our species emerged from the earlier hominids with a capacity to talk about and to reflect on our place in the universe, our place, more specifically, within our planet. Our physical connection with earlier forms of life is indisputable. We are of Earth. As law historian and diplomat Arvid Pardo recalled recently, the dark oceans were the dark oceans were the womb of life. From the protecting oceans, life emerged. We still bear in our bodies, in our blood, in the sultry bitterness of our tears, the marks of this remote past. Our interconnection with other species and the ecological systems of which we are constituents is beyond doubt. And our dependence on earlier species, the air, the land, the water, our dependence upon current species, the air, the land, and the water, for sustaining our lives is indeed radical. With them, we constitute Earth. We are Earth beings with them. We live and function in a biosphere of ecological systems, marginal areas, and myriad plant and animal species. Together, we constitute the Earth community. As moral theologian Larry Rasmussen insistently points to, we humans are part of nature, yet we are distinct. We are free subjects who have moral and spiritual values, humans who transcend nature as creatures who have a spiritual dignity and a shared mission toward the whole of creation. We are in solidarity with other species and systems of Earth, but yet we have those distinct qualities. So Catholic planetary teaching requires striving to live in solidarity with all constituents of the Earth community. Living in solidarity with them means choosing to make decisions now for the common good of all species, of all abiota, of all ecological systems that they constitute, and of the biosphere. And what is the common goal of living in solidarity with all? Well, it's nothing less than the flourishing of the Earth community. Catholic planetary teaching, then, also requires our attention to this principle of subsidiarity. That is, making decisions where we have the most control over our decision making at the most local level, from individual and then on up. But we would make those decisions from a Catholic planetary thought perspective bioregionally, that is, by biological regions. Now we are functioning under political regions, and there are always conflicts going on. And we have one example that I can point to, having worked in it, is making decisions on the basis of the Great Lakes Basin biological region, where you look at rivers and systems from within, and then you have this perspective of the entire Great Lakes Basin ecosystem. And all decisions then are made on the basis of facilitating the flourishing of that ecological system. And representation would always be given in that decision making from a planetary, Catholic planetary thought perspective to future generations. There would be representatives of future generations and also of species and ecological systems from within the larger systems. Their concern, their interest in flourishing would be represented. And I know this sounds like the most radical of all possibilities when you take on a planetary thought perspective, but indeed it's something that's required. Making decisions on the basis of biological regions and not on the basis just of political regions. And finally, caring for God's creation, the most recent of all Catholic social teaching principles. Well, from a Catholic planetary thought perspective, this would require acknowledging the good of the Earth community as the flourishing of the entirety as the greatest common good. Caring for God's creation and caring for it in a way that would facilitate and encourage its flourishing and the flourishing of all of its constituents. I think Thomas Aquinas had the most expansive notion of the common good that was cosmic in scope. And of course, from a 13th century perspective, it's quite different from our perspective today. But if we bring that down to the 21st century and thinking of the common good of our planet, we would then have, I think, a better sense of how we should be functioning. So trying to achieve the planetary common good then. And I wonder if we Catholics are up to it. I think we are, and I know that we have a great deal in our theological tradition from which to draw. It would be from this Catholic planetary thought of the planetary common good, that we would acknowledge that we have that capability to make decisions and to care for God's creation in a way that elevates us as constituents of Earth. And the model of the human that I prefer to use when I think of how we think of ourselves functioning as constituents within the Earth community is the model of the virtuous cooperator. Now, we find this notion of cooperation very solidly in Thomas Aquinas, but we've also seen this in statements by Pope John Paul II, at least St. John Paul II when he was Pope. This notion of human beings as cooperators, not so much as stewards, thinking of ourselves emerging so late in the cosmological, biological, evolutionary process and thinking we can manage what came before us and what exists now. But no, we need to think of ourselves as virtuous cooperators with other species, managing ourselves. That's what we need to manage, ourselves, not manage the Earth. Our focus has to be on how we can make the changes and have this perspective of ourselves as constituents of, virtuous cooperators. And when you build upon those virtues, especially the key moral virtues of prudence and justice and temperance, self-restraint, and then the courage to actually implement all of these virtues and make them habits in our lives, becomes very exciting and certainly quite a challenge. And I think that is, at least implicitly, what Pope Francis is expecting of us when he talks about making an ecological conversion. An ecological conversion of an attitude that each one of us has about ourselves and about our species in relation to other species that constitute the Earth community. Now, one of the things that we know we can draw upon in our tradition to make an ecological conversion, to understand ourselves as part of the Earth community, responsible parts, cooperative constituents, is the grace of God that is always flowing out to us, always available to us. The issue is, will we open to that grace and accept that grace and build upon that grace and then make this conversion to an ecological consciousness that is so essential for us to bring about the flourishing of the Earth community, to stop this tide toward destructiveness of our planet, but move toward wanting and making a commitment to the flourishing of the community of Earth. So I have confidence that we will be able to make the changes that Pope Francis has encouraged in Laudato Si, if we only open up to and accept God's grace to make the changes that are necessary, to be realistic about ourselves as constituents among the other constituents of our planet. Many commitments that we have to make, but I do think we have to begin with ourselves, understanding ourselves as part of the whole. So, I do believe, and I'm convinced by this, and encouraged by this, and compelled even by this fact that Pope Francis has ushered in a new epoch in Catholic thought, Catholic planetary thought. It's inclusive. It's needed. It's desperately needed. It's vital that we take on this kind of thinking. It's vital for the flourishing of the Earth community. It's vital for our own spiritual welfare to make these changes now and to implement them in our lives at every level in which we are involved. So, thank you.